Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Game of consciousness. The darkness was heavy. Cold IT pressed into every corner of the room, which had neither windows nor doors. No light, no sounds, only silence, crushing the mind. The first minutes were filled with helplessness. Most people, finding themselves in such a situation, would try to find a way out, frantically searching for possible doors or windows. But there was nothing. Only walls that seemed to swallow every glance. The person who woke up here didn't remember how they had gotten there. Was this a dream? Maybe a joke? But with each passing second, those questions became less important. The only thing that mattered was what was happening to him now. How did I get here? He whispered to himself, sliding his fingers along the wall, trying to find even a hint of an exit. His skin felt the cold, but fear was stronger. He could feel his mind slowly starting to weaken. After several minutes of searching, he stopped. Somehow, he managed to collect himself. There was nothing familiar here, nothing to indicate time or place. But something was wrong. He could feel it. His heart began to beat faster, as if something was approaching him from the darkness. Maybe it was just his imagination, but the fear was so real that it couldn't be ignored. And then, a strange sound caught his attention. A rustling. The air itself seemed to shift. Something in this room had changed. He turned sharply, but everything remained blurry and incomprehensible. The sound was like a whisper, but not quite. Like voices that couldn't be understood, as if they weren't human. Only one thought held him together. He was not alone here. And at that very moment, something unseen felt it. As soon as he turned back to the wall in front of him, a tiny window appeared. It was so small that it was almost impossible to notice, and even if one did, it was clear that escaping through it was out of the question. This was not just a window. It was something strange, something terrifying, and there was no way out of it. The man didn't know how long he had been sitting there. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. Perhaps it was just a single moment or an entire eternity. And yet, slowly, he raised his hand to the window and heard a sound that changed his life. A rough, metallic voice. "Are you ready to face the trial?" The question rang out as if it were a real sound, filled with an eerie energy, echoing as if from another world. His hands clenched on the metallic surface, and he felt everything around him begin to tighten, as if the room itself was alive, breathing with him. His voice broke from the weight of his emotions. "Who are you? Where am I?" And then the world before his eyes changed. He felt sharp pain surge through his body. Time, space, everything vanished, as if he had been hurled into a projectile, thrown over and over again. He was no longer alone in this room. With each breath, it became harder to stay conscious. Meanwhile, from the corner of the room, where nothing had been before, strange objects began to appear. It looked as if the room itself was part of something much greater. The objects emerged from the darkness. Metallic, unfamiliar, terrifying instruments that rotated and glowed as if they had a mind of their own. And this was only the beginning. Now, as the darkness around him was filled with terrifying shadows, the man felt the pressure on his chest growing stronger. He couldn't breathe, but it wasn't just physical discomfort. No, it was something deeper, as if the very walls of the room were trying to press him into the ground, measuring every movement of his body. From the strange metallic objects, voices began to emerge. At first, they were indistinct, like muffled whispers, but gradually they grew louder, turning into disgusting sounds resembling metal scraping. The man began clutching his head, desperately trying to maintain what little sanity he had left. "What do you want from me?" His voice was distorted with fear. "Why am I here?" There was no answer. Only the endless pressure, forcing his heart to beat faster, like a drum in his chest. Suddenly, the wall in front of him began to slowly open. At first, it was barely noticeable, but gradually the opening widened, revealing a dark, damp room. But what was most terrifying was that in its depths, he could see silhouettes moving, their outlines blurring like ghosts. These were people. People standing motionless, like puppets under the influence of something far more powerful. He couldn't resist and took a few steps toward them, but immediately felt a sharp pain in his head, as if some force was invading his mind, causing his thoughts to spiral into confusion. "This isn't reality. This isn't reality," he whispered through his teeth, trying to deny what was happening. He took a few more steps forward, and suddenly one of the shadows turned toward him. In its face, he saw a reflection of his own eyes. There was something wrong with those eyes. They were empty, soulless, like two black voids that swallowed everything around them. And this strange reflection began to speak. "You don't know what you've become. You don't know why you're here, but you will become part of us." His blood froze. He stepped back, his heart pounding wildly, but the strange voice still echoed in his head, like a reverberation in the dark. "This is the beginning. They will start their experiments with you again." The shadow took several steps toward him, and he felt the air grow heavy, as though he were at the bottom of the ocean. He tried to run, but his legs felt so heavy that even taking a step became impossible. The horrific moment culminated when one of the room's shadows approached him and touched his shoulder. It was like an icy touch that left a terrible sensation of cold in his body, as if all his organs were freezing. He screamed in pain, but it did no good. The room was merciless. And at that moment, he heard it again, the voice breaking through the metal and walls. "You are chosen. You will become part of our experiment. Now your mind no longer belongs to you. Now you will be part of us." The sky darkened, new sounds and images appeared, and his mind began to unravel. His body no longer obeyed him. He was no longer a free man. And again, darkness. The darkness with no way back. Deep in the void, where there is no light, only darkness, new experiments and trials begin. People who were once like him have now become part of something bigger, something that cannot be stopped, something that does not belong to them. They just don't know it yet. And while they sleep, new studies are taking place. They will become part of a horror that will never end. And in the room without windows, without doors, where there is no exit, the former man no longer remembered his identity. Now, he was simply part of this horrifying world. Part of the immortal experiment. The man's mind no longer perceived this world as reality. Everything around him seemed blurred, like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. His consciousness began to break apart into fragments, each one a separate part of this horrific reality. He could no longer distinguish where his body ended and where the room began. The walls seemed endless, yet he was not alone. The feeling that someone was nearby, like an invisible presence, never left him. Strange sounds filled the room, a faint rustling, tapping, and that cursed metallic noise, which no longer seemed just like noise. It was part of something larger, something that could only be understood by this unknown, terrifying world. And then, suddenly, a shadow appeared again. It approached him silently, as though it didn't exist in this world. The man realized that this was no longer just a ghostly image. This was someone who truly existed in this place. The shadow spoke in a low, cold voice that went straight into his brain. "You think you can escape? You think this is just an experiment? You're wrong." The man tried to respond, but he couldn't. His voice froze in his throat, and his thoughts slowly spiraled around aimlessly. He felt parts of himself fading, as if his identity was evaporating. "You are part of a greater game. And now you won't leave," the shadow continued, its face still invisible. "Everyone here can never return to what they once were. We are watching you, and you will be our next experiment." The man couldn't tell whether this was reality or just a memory from his fading mind. He tried to push the shadow away, but his hands didn't obey him. They had become so heavy that every movement required an immense effort. The room began to spin, the walls seemed to tighten around him, and he felt the ground beneath his feet start to move. He couldn't understand whether he was falling, or if something was twisting his body. In an instant, he found himself in another part of the room, and it was even more terrifying. Now everything was clearly visible. Around him stood people he had never met. They were just like him, with vacant stares, soulless, as though their consciousness had been ejected from their bodies. They didn't react to him, but he could feel their presence. These were the same people he had seen at the beginning, but now they had become part of something else. Their bodies began to move, mechanically, like puppets. They slowly approached him, and words came from their mouths, echoing from another world. We no longer have minds, we have become part of this. You too will become part of this. We are all chosen. The feeling of fear and hopelessness consumed the man. His mind could no longer distinguish where reality ended and the nightmare began. He felt his body beginning to change. Something dark, something terrifying, was emerging from within, something that couldn't be stopped. And suddenly, the room began to change. The ceiling darkened, and the floor began to crack. Trails of dark liquid appeared, slowly spreading across the room, filling everything around him. The man could no longer stand. His legs gave way beneath him, but it still didn't hurt. Everything seemed unreal, yet his mind and body felt this horror. Like a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. Strange devices appeared beneath his feet, metal with rusty parts, which seemed to have become part of the room. They began moving toward him, their mechanisms buzzing, and they looked like they were ready to devour him. The man tried to do something, but all his strength had already abandoned him. He felt his willpower fade away completely. And then he felt it. His consciousness started to disappear. Like in a Kabbalistic circle, he became part of this endless experiment, and the room was consuming him with every new step. And in that moment, a new message appeared before his eyes. It was written on the wall in blood. You are no longer you. You are part of us. Darkness swallowed him, and all his fears, pains, and thoughts became part of that horrific universe, where there was no place for salvation. The darkness consumed him completely. It seemed as though his body no longer existed. He felt no pain, no sensation, only an endless space where there was nothing but emptiness. But then, he began to feel something. Flickering flashes, like brief bursts of consciousness that for a moment brought him back to reality. He woke up in another place. It wasn't the same room, but he felt it, as though part of him already belonged to this place. The feeling of alienation didn't disappear, and his gaze wandered through the new darkness. It was just as cold and foul. And that's when he saw them again. The people like him. Only now, they weren't just standing. They were connected to some devices. Metal tubes and wires that extended from their bodies, disconnecting them from reality, leaving only their physical shells. Their eyes were empty, but their movements were mechanical, like puppets on strings. The man tried to move, but his legs felt so heavy. This wasn't just a physical limitation. He could feel something in his body changing, as with every passing second, his consciousness was more consumed by this merciless, endless game. And he knew there would be no escape. Never. And suddenly, from the darkness, came a low, muffled music. It seemed to emanate from the air itself, vibrating around, penetrating inside, filling every cell of his body. The music wasn't melodic. It was a haunting, oppressive sound that made his brain try to hide from it, but he couldn't. It was pain, resonating with his very essence. And then, once again, he heard the voice. It was the same voice he had heard before when he had first woken up in the windowless room. Now it sounded again, but it was different. Silent, cold, like an intrusive presence that was everywhere. You thought this was the end? It's only the beginning. You're not just being experimented on. You're becoming part of us. This is our reality, and now you are no longer alone. The voice grew louder, sounding from all sides, from every wall, even from his own thoughts. He could no longer escape, could not hide. The more he tried to understand why this was happening, the more his consciousness became blurry. All attempts to fight this reality were futile. And then, once again, the shadow appeared before him. It was tall, human-like, but with the same empty face he had seen in those who had become part of this dreadful experiment. You can no longer be what you were, the shadow spoke, its voice inhuman, distorted, mechanical, like the echo of a rift between worlds. We gave you a chance. Now you will be here among us. We are all part of this endless cycle. And now your consciousness will become ours. He wanted to scream, but couldn't. His body didn't obey him, and his mind was no longer his own. The shadow took a step forward, and he felt something penetrate his consciousness. He felt his thoughts beginning to dissolve, as he transformed into something else, beyond time, beyond space. Now he was no longer just part of the experiment. He had become part of it indefinitely. His consciousness was destroyed, and he felt it, like mechanical elements slowly consuming him from the inside. This was what he had feared. He had become part of something that no longer had humanity, part of a soulless, cold machine that had once been an experiment. And once again, he felt himself becoming part of this vast cycle. It was no longer just a matter of time, but a matter of existence itself. He was no longer human. He had become something else. Something that no longer had a place in reality, but existed there, in the endless darkness, where the merciless game of the mind continues unceasingly, over and over again. And everyone who enters here becomes part of this endless game. This was the end for him. And the end for everyone who had ever ended up here. And so, with each new chosen one, this dark reality would expand, swallowing more and more consciousness, placing them into infinite cycles of experiments that would never end. Time in this place had lost its meaning. Moments became endless, and each of them gave him no relief. The man could no longer comprehend how much time had passed, whether it had been hours or thousands of years. Everything around him had become an abstraction, like a dark abyss that consumed everything. The people who had become part of this experiment no longer seemed alive. They were more like imprints of something that once had a soul. Their movements were clumsy, their eyes empty, like two black holes that swallowed everything around them. And although his consciousness was no longer his own, he began to realize one terrifying thing. He was not the first. He was not the first to end up here. And certainly not the last. The feeling that this was an endless cycle became unbearable. Now he understood. Each of these people had once been like him. Each of them had been an individual who had survived the horrors of this room and eventually became part of something larger, something that mercilessly consumed their mind and soul. And now he was one of them, one of the faceless shadows that wandered endlessly in this chaos. And as soon as he began to understand this, the room changed. Not just its appearance, but its very nature. The ceiling lowered, and the walls began to move, squeezing him, and again that feeling of drowning. But it was not physical pain. It was a deep sensation that his consciousness was being compressed, that it could no longer contain what was happening. Once again, he heard the voices. This time, they did not sound human. They came from every corner of the room, and every whisper, every word, carried something that could not be understood. They spoke as if to him. "We found you. You are next. You are chosen, and now you will become part of us." All these voices blended into one terrible symphony, from which his mind almost shattered. Every word, every echo in his head reminded him that he was no longer himself. He was something else. Something terrifying. Part of this dreadful system. Suddenly, another shadow appeared before him. It resembled the one that had come to him earlier. This time, he couldn't tell if it was human or not, because the face he saw had no expression. It was just empty. The shadow extended its hand to him, and he felt the touch penetrate his mind. It was like cold metal seeping into every cell, slowly taking his essence. "Now you understand," the shadow whispered, and its voice sounded like a scream in the void, "that you can no longer contain yourself. You are part of this world. You are part of our game." The man felt his mind gradually transform into something else, as his thoughts no longer belonged to him. It was as if he were watching himself from the outside, but his body no longer obeyed. He was part of this entity, part of the mechanism that worked ceaselessly, without rest. And suddenly everything changed. As if the darkness before him vanished, and in its place, light appeared. But it was not natural light. It was blue, cold, dead. It was light that could not be real, but it filled the room like an invisible monster, swallowing everything. He felt his consciousness beginning to finally crumble. His body no longer belonged to him, and his soul could no longer fight this reality. From now on, he was part of this world, part of the dark system that had no end. But when he thought that his consciousness had finally been swallowed by the darkness, a number appeared before him, covered in blood. "You are the eternal experiment, and this experiment will never end." And then he understood. Everything that had happened no longer mattered. He had become part of something that had no beginning or end. He was part of the endless game of the mind, and this game would continue as long as there was even a single understanding of what had once been human. The darkness enveloped him again, and he felt his consciousness finally dissolve in this merciless world. And this world, with no beginning or end, had no place for any hope. Only the endless game, in which he had become part of everything. No words, no thoughts, no end. Now he no longer felt time. Everything around him was a closed loop, and every movement, every thought was part of this endless cycle. As his consciousness transformed into part of this horrific mechanism, he realized that it no longer mattered what had come before. And those echoes of voices, carrying despair and hopelessness, could not disturb the peace of this emptiness. But somehow, amidst this irreversible descent, he heard something new. It was a faint, barely audible whisper that broke through the continuous flow of darkness. His mind tried to find this thread, and he felt something coming back to life in his head. "You are not alone," the whisper echoed. These words sparked flashes of memories, like small sparks in the darkness. It seemed like he had heard this from someone familiar. He couldn't remember who, but he felt that this voice was real. No, this was not just a vision or a ghost. It was a reality breaking through his shattered consciousness. He focused, trying to connect with this voice, but everything around him was blurry, as if he were in another dimension. And suddenly, on the edge of his understanding, he saw it. Light. A beam cutting through the darkness. His mind began to return, and although he was still part of this dreadful place, he felt a chance of salvation appearing. Was it just an illusion? Or perhaps it was the final step toward complete destruction. His hands began to move, feeling the solidity around him. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. At first, they seemed distant, but they quickly approached. Figures appeared from the maze of darkness. People, like him. They walked directly toward him, moving in sync, like automated puppets. Their gazes weren't focused on him, but he felt them looking at him from within. Their eyes were empty, but their movement and gestures betrayed a consciousness that hadn't fully disappeared. The man tried to move again, and this time he succeeded in lifting one leg. Gradually, he began to slide forward, stumbling with every step. The sensation of pain and discomfort became his new companions, but he didn't give up. Suddenly, he felt one of those moving with him becoming distinct. It was one of the figures, a man who still had some residual consciousness left. "You are not alone," he said, slowly approaching. "We are all here. All of us who have lost ourselves. But you can still be saved. There's a chance." These words seemed unreal. How could he save himself in this merciless place, where everyone was part of a great game with no beginning or end? But he felt that this voice was not deceiving him. Maybe it was just a shard of hope, or maybe it was a true awakening. The shadow before him began to move closer, and in that moment, when he tried to push it away, he felt his body begin to change. They were not just becoming shadows, they were something more, something living and malevolent. Their forms started to distort, and he realized that this was no longer just an experiment. It was a trial, and now he was part of it. His mind began to tremble, but he still took the final step. The shadow pulled him back. The man felt his mind start to drift away again. Something was consuming his consciousness once more. But suddenly, he woke up. He woke up in a new room. And again, no windows, no doors. And everything repeated itself again. The man lay motionless. His body was cold, as if he had just broken free from a thin layer of ice. He could hear something buzzing nearby, monotonous and intrusive, like the sound of a broken electronic device. The air was still, heavy, and every breath carried a metallic taste in his mouth. He was here again. In a new room. No windows. No doors. No exit. But now, he remembered. This had all happened before. He hadn't just survived this nightmare, he was living it again and again. Hundreds of times. Thousands. He was part of an endless experiment that kept him trapped in this loop. But this time, something was different. He felt movement. Somewhere in the darkness, at the edge of his vision, something shifted. At first slowly, like a ghost rising from the night, then suddenly, like a predator spotting its prey. His heart began to race. The shadow that stood in the corner stepped forward. Its body was brittle, as if made from fragments of burnt wood, and its eyes. They weren't glowing, but he felt them on him. They saw him. "You woke up again," a voice whispered. It wasn't mechanical, but a human voice. It seemed familiar. The man couldn't speak. His throat was constricted by an invisible noose. But he didn't look away from the figure. "There's no escape from this," the voice grew muffled, filled with despair. "They test us. Each time they make us forget. But The figure approached, and now he saw its face. It was him. His own face. But not fresh, not alive. It was him, exhausted, with dark hollows where his eyes should be, with wounds on his skin that revealed something mechanical beneath. "You're next," his second self whispered. At that moment, he felt something grab him from behind. Invisible hands, cold and alien, pulled him down. Darkness engulfed him completely, like a wave sweeping away the last traces of life on the shore. And again, he woke up. Again, the room. Again, no windows. Again, no doors. But this time, something was different. The room was breathing. The walls pulsed like a living organism. He could hear something flowing inside them. Thick, sticky, like blood. The air filled with a rotten stench. He was no longer in a sterile room. This place was alive. And then he heard it. Voices. Hundreds, thousands of voices whispering at once. They were everywhere. They were inside him. "Can you hear us?" They sang, their sound merging into a dreadful cacophony. The man covered his ears, but it didn't help. The voices continued. "You are one of us. One of millions. One of the endless." Suddenly, something touched his hand. He jerked back sharply, but couldn't stop himself from screaming. The hand lying beside him on the floor was his own, but his body was intact. He looked down and saw that pieces of himself were scattered around. Hands, legs, even a face. He screamed, but no sound came out. The shadow appeared again. "Don't fight it," it spoke in his voice. He could no longer move. His body began to fall apart. He felt his own hands start to pull away from him, his skin dissolving, leaving only wires that connected him to this place. He was not human. He had never been human. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a factory, and he was one of its products. Consciousness faded. Darkness enveloped him for the last time. And then it all began again. He woke up again. But this time, something was wrong. The darkness was no longer absolute. It had changed. It had become thicker, denser, like smoke filling the room. But the worst part wasn't even that. He remembered. Not fully. Just fragments. The shadow that had his face. Parts of his body scattered on the floor. Voices whispering inside his head. But most terrifying of all was the realization. It would never end. He was no longer just a victim of the experiment. He was the experiment. He sat up and felt something beneath him. Not the cold floor. Not a metal table. Something soft. Wet that he looked down. A carpet. But it wasn't an ordinary carpet. It was made of skin. Human skin. The man gasped and recoiled. But the walls began to move. They were no longer smooth. Now they breathed, expanding with each inhale, contracting with each exhale, like massive lungs feeding this nightmare with life. The voices began again. "You woke up," they hissed, and he realized it wasn't just sounds in his head. Someone was here. He turned and saw them. Hundreds of bodies suspended from the ceiling like marionettes. Their eyes were wide, mouths open in silent screams, and long black wires pulsed out of their chests like living veins. One of them moved. "Help!" it rasped. The man recoiled, but his back slammed into something hard. A door. He touched it, and in that instant, there was a click. The lock unlocked. His heart pounded in his chest. He no longer thought. He just surged forward. The door creaked open with a deafening sound. Behind it was darkness. But it was a different kind of darkness. It wasn't empty. It was watching him. He took a step, and the darkness consumed him. And then he woke up again. But this time, he was not alone. Someone was breathing beside him in the dark. He was not alone. The breathing beside him was raspy, wet, as if it came from someone whose lungs were filled with blood. The man froze. His body turned ice cold. He felt his heart pounding in his throat, every cell screaming, "Don't move!" But it was too late. What stood next to him already knew he had woken up. The breathing stopped. And in that instant, something grabbed his throat. Sticky fingers coiled around his neck, pressing him to the cold floor. He tried to break free, but the grip was iron-tight. The darkness in front of him slowly began to take shape. It was a face, but not a human one. The eyes, two black holes, in which shadows spiraled. The skin, puffed up, as if it had been boiled in water for hours. The lips stretched into a smile that wasn't a smile. It was something more. Something worse. The fingers on his neck tightened even more. "You woke up." The voice wasn't a voice. It was a whisper, made of hundreds of other voices. The man gasped, desperately trying to breathe. His eyes bulged as he noticed that this creature, it had his face, but not his present face. It was him, dead, disfigured, torn apart, but alive. The darkness behind him swayed, and more figures began to emerge. They came one after another, distorted, with faces that should not exist. Some had no eyes, others had their mouths sewn shut with coarse black thread, some had their heads split in half, but they moved. They were all him. The man broke into hysterics, his body writhing in convulsions, but the hands around his neck did not let go. "We woke up before you," they whispered. "We died first. Now it's your turn." And then he felt it. His own skin began to crack. First on his arms, then on his chest. The flesh beneath it pulsed, as if something inside was trying to break free. He screamed. He didn't want to die. His face split in half. Black hands began to crawl out of his own mouth. And then he woke up again. But this time, in a mirrored room. And in the mirrors, he did not see his reflection. He saw himself being killed. In the mirrors, he saw himself being killed. Each reflection showed a different moment of his death. In one, he was burning, his flesh melting and charring, his eyes bursting from the heat. In another, his body tore apart from the inside, as if something lived inside him and was ripping its way out, pushing against his bones. In the next one he stood, but without skin, his bare flesh pulsing, and something invisible slowly pulling him into the darkness. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. His eyes no longer belonged to him. The mirrors changed. They no longer reflected death. They showed memories. His childhood. A home he no longer remembered. Him in a white hospital gown, strapped to a bed. People in masks. Injections. Screams. He had always been here. Not a day, not a week. His whole life. He was not a human. He was created. His mind began to crack again. The voices returned. "You are an experiment. You are a failed prototype. You must be destroyed." The darkness began to gather in the center of the room. It twisted, grew denser, turning into something alive. It was a creature. Huge. Black. Its body was made of intertwined human bodies, jerking in convulsions. Their mouths were open in silent screams, and their hands reached out, as if trying to escape. And it was getting closer. No, he didn't want to die. He remembered everything. This wasn't just an experiment. This was a game. His consciousness was being tested, broken, killed, over and over. And each time he came back. No, not this time. He wouldn't let them. The man screamed. For the first time, he didn't run. He lunged forward, straight into the darkness. And it swallowed him. Then everything ended. He opened his eyes. Light. He was lying in a hospital bed. Needles were sticking out of his veins. Monitors beside him gave a steady beep. The door opened. A doctor in a white coat approached him. "Patient 237 has come out of the coma," he said, making a note in his notebook. The man blinked. "What, where am I?" The doctor smiled. "Don't worry. You were in experimental treatment. You've been asleep for a long time. No, this can't be real." His memories were still fresh. He remembered everything. The doctor leaned closer. "It's okay," he whispered. His eyes were black. And then the man understood. It would never end. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.